Have you been wondering how to build a successful strategy with open source for your company? Or why would you invest in open source projects when you can use the code for free? Are you an open source maintainer on the edge of burnout? Or a newcomer who's too intimidated to take the first steps and get involved? Maybe you're not a code developer and you think that there's no place for you in the open source ecosystem. You're not alone. My name is Ildiko Vancha, and this is the My Open Source Experience podcast, where my guests and I share our open source journeys with all the successes, the struggles, and joyful moments. Find the answers to your questions and dilemmas, and more importantly, join us and be part of the community. Hello, everyone, and welcome back on the My Open Source Experience podcast. I have Rick Turoczy with me today, and we will dive into, open source per usual, but also we will talk about open source contributions, but we will not talk about code because there seems to be this silent association between contributor and code developer. Maybe tech writer also belongs into that bucket, but outside of that, there's so many other things that you can do to contribute to the open source project that you're participating in or the open source ecosystem to ensure its success and sustainability. But we don't really talk about these things. So today we will. But before we dive into all that, Rick, can you please introduce yourself a little bit? What's your background in the industry and what do you do today?
Sure. Yeah, happy to do it. I'm Rick Turoczy. I'm in Portland, Oregon, on the west coast of the US. Been here about 30 years. The whole time I've been here, I've worked in, on, and around venture-funded tech startups for the first part of my career, largely in proprietary software that often had some tangential open source activity, but then throughout my career, open source languages, frameworks, database structures became more and more of software development and the software development world. So I've been closely aligned with what's happening in open source communities for probably the past 20 years or so. And then I often say I open sourced my marketing communications by starting a blog and writing kind of promotional material about the startup community here in Portland. So that's kind of been I wasn't talented enough to code or to contribute code, so I decided to open source my marketing communications instead.
And I think there are a lot of people out there who are very appreciative of the fact that you were quote unquote not talented enough to do code and rather chose to venture into other areas because at least in my personal experience when it comes to marketing and those kind of things, really, really not easy.
Yeah, yeah, fair, yeah. Yeah, and like honestly, to me, developing code has always seemed like a creative pursuit to me, and like developers often exhaust that creativity building a thing or contributing code to a thing and don't have any creative reservoir to then market said thing. So I'm more than happy to kind of step in and help with that kind of stuff.
I can 100% relate to that. I mean, I used to write software. This is how I got in touch with open source. But when it comes to like doing these days, social media promotion is like the hot thing to do. And social media posts are not long, but you have no idea how long I procrastinate on it, or not even procrastinate. I just stare in front of myself on the at the
Yeah.
laptop and try to figure out what should go into those 240 characters.
Hmm.
I think that's what tweet is or whatever we call it
Right.
today.
Whatever it is.
It's tremendous amount of time no matter what you
Mhm.
do. At least for my brain it's just not, it's not simple and easy. So even when I get the chance to read someone's blog like yours, um my brain gets ideas. And it goes both for topics, writing style, or the approach to structure content. So I think that is pretty cool that you do it. And I'm one of the people out there who appreciate
Thank you. Yeah, happy to do it.
this type of work. I mentioned how I got in touch with open source. Do you remember when you first encountered free and open source software, or this whole movement? Like, when did you learn about it?
Yeah, I think I encountered it before I had a name for it. Like I used to mess around with like Perl and a few other like early language. I learned to code in BASIC, which was basically open source, and then really got into web development. So HTML as a open source kind of language. And so my initial exposure was grade school level stuff. And I think it wasn't until I entered the kind of, my profession that I encountered the terminology open source and had a way to describe that work and what was being done. And then like there was also this time in the like early 90s where shareware was a big concept, which today they would refer to as freemium model kind of things, where you get some for free, but you pay for other functionality. And so in many ways, that was also kind of touching on conceptually open source kind of technology, because they'd often allow you to, tweak the code to make the products do what you wanted them to do. But it wasn't until I was working for an established company that was building proprietary software, but had some open source templating and coding structures associated with the product. So that would have been mid to late 90s at that point where I very first encountered it. And then throughout my career here, Portland at a time, especially near the turn of the century, was really a hub of open source activity. We were a longtime host of O'Reilly's OSCON convention. We had, Ward Cunningham, the guy who created the wiki, is a Portland person. Linus Torvalds has lived here off and on. And we had, some significant folks from the Python community and the R community and like stuff like that. So like it's always kind of been immersed in our community in an interesting way. And I was really drawn to become more active in the community. One, when I started using blogging platforms that were specifically like WordPress that were open source, and I wanted to give back to that community. And then honestly, that's just where the most interesting stuff was happening in Portland at the time. Everything was coming out of the open source community, or it was, folks who were well phrased in Ruby, Ruby on Rails, Python, and the advent of cloud infrastructure really enabled them to develop things far more rapidly than they had been able to in the past. And so it was kind of that perfect storm of things occurring that really drew me into the community in a meaningful way.
Like you mentioned at the beginning that you stumbled on the free software concept and languages at the beginning, and you mentioned shareware. Do you remember when you realized or learned that behind these openly available tools and software, there are communities and people who participate in these communities either as volunteers, or they might be paid by a company to do the job, but they're still doing that work in an open, public, collaborative environment. So when did that part of open source became clear to you?
Probably not until, 2000, somewhere around that time frame, I can remember, because I think up until that point, I recognized that individuals could build things that then they would open source or give away or whatever they wanted to do. But I didn't understand the collaborative dynamic or the community dynamic of multiple people contributing to a single source. And I think it was really, the WordPress community brought that into sharp relief for me, as well as Ruby on Rails, I think, was the other one that it was at the time a really popular way of developing products, and it became clear that it was more than a few people who are contributing to making that easier to use and more effective. No matter who might take credit for the building that framework, but it was really then that it started to dawn on me that it's like, this is not just a person or a couple of people. This is a significant number of folks who are often spending their free time working to make the best product possible in a very voluntary way. And then that continued to morph, where I would encounter the kind of sponsored participants as well. So it's somebody who is paid by a corporate entity to contribute specifically to an open source project. Like those people kind of came into my orbit, and it just eventually became this understanding that the ethos was, how do we build the best product possible? But the fueling that development was always passion more than anything else. And that was really compelling to me. Like that seemed to be, a lot seemed to be a lot more pure of a pursuit in terms of building things and crafting things than I had encountered in the proprietary software world, which was generally, how do we build something that people will pay for, not necessarily how do we build the best thing possible that people will pay for.
So this idea of people working together towards a common goal that they are personally interested and invested in, it sounds like that was what drew you to get involved in the ecosystem.
It was like, I don't think it was anything intentional. It was just, I was kind of like, through osmosis, learning about the industry and what was going on, and the people I was hanging out with were deeply involved in those communities, and so it just became clear to me that if the people who were important to me and who I thought were doing interesting things were part of the open source community, then it made sense that I should try and spend as much time with those communities as I could, because then I would find more interesting and creative and innovative people in our community. And so it wasn't anything planned. It just kind of, like, little by little, I was just more and more part of that community, which was interesting.
Do you remember how you got involved in these communities? Like, what were your first contributions to ones where you started to hang out and get involved?
Yeah. So Portland, for people who might not be aware of the geography, we're kind of in between Seattle, Washington, and the Bay Area in California. And so we often kind of keep an eye on what's going on in those communities. And down in the Bay Area, O'Reilly had run this kind of private little get together called Foo Camp. And as a kind of open source equivalent to that, they had started a format called Bar Camp, which was, and because of course, Foo Bar. And the premise of that was, it was an unconference. It was an event that you showed up and built the agenda dynamically as a community, as a group, and basically, you were doing pull requests against the event schedule to say we think this belongs in here, and this is a bug and we need to fix this. And that was really the first like way I was able to effectively engage in that community. And we had started a version of bar camp here in Portland, a few of the people I knew. And so that was really like me dipping my toe into taking an active role in that community. And then that of course led to me starting to blog about what I was seeing in the community using, and I was already on WordPress, but no one was reading that blog that I was doing. So I started the new one on WordPress, and yeah, then I was having to deal with like new builds and new plugins and all those kind of things. So that was, and spammy SQL injections and stuff like that. So I kind of got dragged kicking and screaming into that side of it, but it was something I got to experience as well.
In terms of your first involvement, you attended that open source
Bar
event,
camp, yeah.
Barcamp, and you took part in organizing a similar one at the location where you were based, which was still is Portland.
Yeah. Yeah. And then that became a series of events. And then that kind of blossomed into, well, if we can use this format for this type of event, why don't we pick other subjects that we can do unconferencey type things with? And so that just kind of different unconference events kept popping up in town. And then at the same time, we were building, a WordCamp Portland. So the WordPress community gatherings that happen all over the world and are, managed by the community. So some of those started to pop up, and I was involved in those, both from a planning and speaking standpoint. And then I eventually speaking at OSCON and attending OSCON became kind of part of that whole event thing as well.
Do you remember what were the values and what was the experience that you saw when you started to attend open source events at the beginning that just kind of clicked with you and inspired you to not just go and attend more events, which most of us do, but also put a lot of effort into building these for the community or communities in your area?
Yeah, it was the level of personal connection. I'm fairly introverted. I don't relish the idea of going to events, but like being at events, there's a different level of humanity and connectivity that's availed by that format. And I think for me, it was, social media wasn't a thing, but bloggers knew about other people's blogs, and we would often like block quote one another's blogs and do trackback links or a comment or whatever. And so there was a similar to today where there's that weird parasocial relationship where you're like, I know that person because I follow them on Blue Sky and I see what they say, so I must know who they are. Um, it was really a way of, putting actual humans together with their online persona, and often being in a room that it looked like a bunch of avatars walking around, because I'm like, oh, I know you and I know you, but I've never met you before, but I know how you speak and I know how you think. And the events, the reason I think I found them most compelling is no matter how effusive or transparent people are online when they're creating content, some people are naturally predisposed to that kind of transparency. You still weren't getting the whole story unless you met those people in person. And there were always interesting little nuggets that they would say offhandedly where it's like, that's way more interesting than anything I've ever seen you post online. So that in person part of it was the thing that made me understand how compelling events could be in that regard. In my career, I had managing events was part of my job, and so I had a very different perspective on what the value of an event was, and it was generally, top of the funnel deal and customer gathering kind of stuff. And so this was the first time where I was attending events more as an attendee and participant, less so as a sponsor speaker kind of thing. And so that gave me a totally different perspective on events themselves.
Did you ever like get involved in as an organizer in conferences that were already running, or do you have more experience creating new events and meetups and user groups in your area?
I more am a kind of person who starts things usually as a prototype kind of thing. Like I'm not necessarily convinced it's gonna have an ongoing thing. It may be like a one-off event, but I can't think of any that I joined when it was already kind of a going thing. Most of mine have all been I'm the person who helped start the original version of the thing, and that's just the part that's intriguing to me. Like it's so much like I try and celebrate startup founders because what they're doing is incredibly hard. Like events aren't rocket science, but there is a lot of like non-obvious knowledge that is not shared very broadly about like all the tactics and things that go into events and programming. And given my, just career experience there, like the first the first startup where events fell under my purview, we had 52 events a year. So, that's basically averages one event a week, but that means that some weeks we were at like 5 events simultaneously kind of thing. And it was a nightmare that like if we hadn't developed process to manage that, it would have been a complete failure. And so I know how I don't like doing events. I just know how to do them. So like, and that's usually where I want to participate is helping realize either someone else's vision, like helping them programmatically build the thing they want to build, or just using my knowledge of events to develop that prototype that somebody else might say, hey, that's interesting. Like Open Source Bridge was among the founding team to start that one. Portland Startup Week was the person who started that one. And then TechFest Northwest, which used to be a kind of destination tech event in Portland, I started that as well. But each of those then became opportunities to hand that off once they were proven out and kind of had, you know, thematically they were a real thing and process wise they were a real thing. Then I kind of lose interest and I'm like, here, go do something with this thing we built. So I generally wind up participating for a few years and then handing them off to somebody else.
So what did you learn in like from your professional career of doing events that made a difference in creating Open Source Bridge and the other events that you were mentioning?
Communication is key. Over communication is the key. I think often people kind of are focused on selling the ticket to the thing and they see that's the end goal. Well, I put on an event and people bought tickets, so it was a successful event. And I'm like, there's so much more you got to do. And the like everybody needs communication. Like I've participated in events where I'm literally having to reach out to them being like, I'm speaking, can you tell me where I'm supposed to be and when I'm supposed to be there? So like communicating with your speakers, like communicating with the attendees, like those, I'm a huge fan of the, and I always try and do this, especially with like multi-day events. I love the email you get the night before where it's like, here's what the weather's going to be, and don't forget these are the events, and this is what the lunch is going to be, and don't forget this and that and the other thing, and those come out every morning, and you're like, oh, I feel prepared for today as an attendee. And the same thing for speakers, like keeping them in the loop and those kind of things, and prep, just general prep. Like so many people do events where they're like, oh yeah, we're having this panel and none of the panelists have met one another before they get on stage. And I'm like, what are you doing? Like, that's not how you do that. Like, they should know one another. Like, you need to give them time to get comfortable with one another so that there's a presence on stage. And yeah, it's a lot of the, like, I think people get very worked up about the promotion of events and they think less about the production of events. And I just, that's where I excel, is in more of the production thing. Like my friends hate working with me on events. Like sometimes I'll volunteer to support events and they're like, you're so anal about all this stuff. And I'm like, but this is how events work. This is why it works. You got to do this. And they're like, it'll be fine. I'm like, it won't be fine. We need to do this the right way. Um, so like, it's just a way, it's yet another way of kind of open sourcing my knowledge to the benefit of others in the community. And so I'll be a stagehand. Like I'm like one or the other. Like I need to do it, do the whole thing, figure everything out, start it, or like I have other people who are playing that role in my life, and I'm more like the AV guy. Like I'll show up and make sure the slides go and the audio works and all that kind of stuff. But yeah, I'm on either end of the spectrum. I'm not much in the middle.
How was the experience of doing these like open source and community events compared to like you were doing that for your job, but when you're starting something just out of the blue, quote unquote, like how was that experience? Like how did you make that work?
Managing open source events is an entirely different animal than managing like a different event. Like generally, in my experience, and this might not ring true for everybody, but in my experience with the open source stuff, it is so much consensus committee driven activity. And in my other events, whether I programmed them or whether if I was doing them for work, like I was the person making the decisions about what was going to happen, and it was more like, this is what's going to happen. I hope you like it because that's what's going to happen. Whereas with the open source stuff, it was a lot more of, you know, convincing and arguing for perspectives and reasoning about why things could happen, but also compromising a lot. You know, there were things that only worked in open source. And to give the background of Open Source Bridge, so OSCON was in Portland. I don't know for how many years, but it became a regular thing that OSCON was always in Portland. And then suddenly one year O'Reilly went, we're not doing it in Portland this year. And we're like, what are you talking about? We rely on that event not only to bring people from outside to our community, but our local community uses that as a gathering to do important community work for ourselves. So selfishly, like, we need it for our community. And they're like, yeah, sorry, we're not going to do Portland anymore. I think they probably did, like San Francisco or a larger metropolitan area. And so a number of the folks in the community were like, well, we have to have an open source event. We can't go a summer without having a major open source event. And so that became the start of Open Source Bridge. And so I joined again to help stand it up to provide. So I had the opportunity to provide some like early sponsorship for them, as well as being the kind of promotional lead in terms of getting the word out and all those kind of things, and then helped with the structure of the programming and how it was going to be run. But there are things that I didn't understand about the community that if I tried to like force my opinion into that, it probably would have been, a failure or would not have worked like I had expected. And so it was really nice to have people who were, like there was a person who was deeply involved in the Postgres community there, a bunch of Rails people, some Python people, but people who were definitely immersed in the community dynamics of their particular open source pursuits. And they made some decisions about what needed to happen and how it needed to run that made it far more compelling and valuable to the open source community than perhaps the traditional way of running a quote unquote tech event might be.
Did you ever get feedback from the people and communities how it made a difference for them that you put on these events?
Oh, for sure. Yeah, like specifically with open source bridge, it was almost like a breath of fresh air for a lot of people. They're like, OSCON has gotten so big and kind of corporate that this was a really nice grassroots departure that gave the attendees the same value they were seeking from OSCON, but with a totally different vibe. And so the founding team got a lot of great feedback about that. Like sometimes events with the least structure and programming are the ones I get the most positive feedback about. I think you just have to recognize that community is artificial. Like it doesn't occur naturally. Like humans are drawn to community, but like you have to create that center of gravity artificially to make it work. And so like events often are that excuse for people to gather. And I'm really lucky to live where I live in that Portland people are always really good about conveying positive feedback as well as critical feedback. Like they may criticize stuff you're doing or provide constructive criticism, but they also will always be like, this was great. I love this about this. I can't believe you got this speaker to come. Like, you need to do this next year. Like that level of feedback. They're always effusive about events that strike a chord with them. So yeah, that's part of the motivation to keep doing that work. I think the challenge there is it's also very easy to fall into the trap of continuing to do something just because you received positive feedback on it once long ago. Like I think people get really nostalgic about events and like they are like, oh, well, you've done this for so many years. You should just keep doing it. And I'm just like, well, it's not working. Why would we? It stopped functioning like it was supposed to function. Why would we keep doing that? And, but they just want it to happen because it's always happened in their opinion. And so I'm also a huge fan of being part of the decision to be like, we're not doing this anymore. And don't ever try and reboot this event. Don't like I'll hand it off if people want to keep it going and they think they have a vision for where it can go. But I'm equally happy to say this was fun. This was a moment in time, but we're done with that now. And we're not going to start doing that ever again.
So what are the keys to sustain an event series? Because it sounds like that some or many of these events that you organize, they didn't necessarily just happen once. So how do you sustain the event and the community and have people come again?
Yeah, great question. Uh, One of my soapboxes is like an event is not that one day or that one week that the event occurs. A single event happens 365 days a year. You need to be communicating, connected in community with those people day in and day out throughout the entire year. You all just happen to gather at a specific point in time. So, that is the secret. It's like, it's not showing up 2 months before the event is going to happen and being like, hey, are you going to come? You haven't heard from me for 9 months, but are you going to come to the event? Like, you've got to stay in touch with that audience, and they maybe not driving the programming or driving the structure, but their opinions should be influencing how you structure that. And that can be more than, like a call for proposals, and being able to vote on proposals is one way of engaging the community in a meaningful way in the programmatic elements of an event. But you need other like perspectives and opinions beyond just the content that is being delivered. Um, like we threw an event at the beginning of this year, and we had an attendee who was in a wheelchair who showed up, and we realized that we had not structured the space with clear travel lanes so that that person could get where they needed to get in the event. And that was our mistake, and that was our error, and we acknowledged that. And that became critical to the next time we held a gathering, that we ensured that 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 was something that we had thought of and that we were dealing with. We touched on like how ridiculously privileged I am in my early days of events. Like, I don't even think we had a second thought about like, oh, this is an all white male panel. And like that would have like, we wouldn't have like even thought twice about that. And these days I will I will never be present on an all male white panel. I will never program an all male white panel. Like, it's like there are so many things over the course of the history of events and how our communities have changed and evolved that makes some of the things we used to do seem pretty ridiculous. So I think, trying to be as conscious of the diverse elements of your community and your attendee base, and using that as a means to inspire you to do things differently, or to do things that are more accessible and receptive to everyone who wants to attend. Like, those are the other parts about kind of keeping the community engaged and keeping the life of the event. Is, if someone shows up to your event and they don't see themselves on stage and don't see themselves in the attendees, then they're probably not coming back. So, like, you have an obligation to reflect them on in the content, on stage, in attendance. Like, just like, that's the other part of ensuring that people remain engaged, is they find their people. And like, sometimes that's a very discrete group of people, and that's fine. Not every event has to be thousands of people, but like, right size the event for the community that's deriving value from it, and then ensure that the community is accurately reflected and participatory throughout the year.
Before we depart, Rick, can you please tell us something about yourself that has nothing to do with organizing events, open source, the tech industry, some kind of a hobby or a fun fact?
This is always so hard for me. People are like, what do you do when you're not dealing with startups? And I'm like, when I'm not dealing with, I'm always dealing with startups. I cook. I love to cook. Like, that's my like relaxation thing. Like, I don't care how hard my day was. Like, I can always spend a couple hours cooking and it'll totally like chill me out. So as far as like another creative outlet, it's usually cooking.
Do you make your own recipes? Like, you look at ingredients and you just cook up whatever you feel like, or you go and look things up and
No, I freeform everything, and I'm horrible with recipes. Like I can't bake to save my life because I'm just like I don't understand how this works. What do you mean you only put in that amount of that thing? Yeah, so it's more by look and taste and that kind of thing. And something I've done like my entire life. Like even when I was a kid, I really enjoyed cooking, but it was always one of those just um, means to an end kind of thing for the longest time. And it's only in recent years that it's become more of a like enjoyable thing to do and more more like trying. When I was younger, I got really good at cooking certain things and had a repeatable kind of process. But now I'm more like open to exploring things. I'm like, I've never cooked that before, but I can try and figure it out kind of thing.
So you reached that point where it became more of that creative outlet as opposed to I need to eat something.
Right. Exactly.
Raw stuff is good too, but if it's cooked, it might be better.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and the plating and stuff, like, I don't know why I've become obsessed with plating lately, but I'm like, oh, that doesn't look quite right. Like so that kind of aspect of it as well. So not just the food, but how the food is presented and plated and all those kind of things.
So it sounds like that there might be an open source cookbook kind of
Yeah,
thing
maybe a
in
real
the future.
cookbook. Yeah, and it would have to be open source because I'm like, I don't know, put some stuff in, and you decide how much. Like, yeah, but yeah, you never can tell. I might have to write a real cookbook.
And with that, that's all, folks. That was our episode for today. What did resonate with you the most? What new ideas, strategy, or useful tips did you hear today? Or you have a comment or follow-up question to ask? Comment on the episode below or start a conversation on your favorite social media platform. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share the podcast so others can discover it too. And stay tuned because the next episode is just around the corner.